Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the school playground, watching her 8-year-old daughter Emma being surrounded by a group of older kids. The laughter wasn't the kind that warmed hearts. It was cruel, mocking, and getting louder by the minute. "My mom was in the Navy SEALs," Emma said again, her small voice trying to sound confident despite the tears forming in her eyes. She really was. The circle of kids erupted in even louder laughter. Tommy Richardson, the biggest kid in 5th grade, stepped forward with a smirk plastered across his face. "Yeah, right, Emma. Girls can't be SEALs. Everyone knows that. You're such a liar." Sarah's heart broke a little more with each cruel word. She wanted to march over there and defend her daughter, but she knew Emma needed to learn to stand up for herself. Still, watching her child be ridiculed for telling the truth about her mother's service was almost unbearable. "SEALs are tough guys who fight bad guys," another kid chimed in. "Your mom probably just worked in an office or something. She's making stuff up." Emma's face turned red, not from embarrassment, but from anger. "She's not making it up. She has medals and everything. She saved people." The kids laughed even harder. Some started making exaggerated military poses, pretending to march around in circles while making silly faces. Others began chanting, "Liar, liar, pants on fire." Mrs. Henderson, the playground supervisor, finally noticed the commotion and walked over. She was an older woman who had worked at the school for nearly 20 years and had seen just about everything, but when she heard what the children were arguing about, even she looked skeptical. "Now, children, let's all calm down," Mrs. Henderson said, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma, honey, maybe you misunderstood something your mom told you. The Navy SEALs are a very special group of soldiers, and they're all men." Emma looked up at the teacher with wide, disbelieving eyes. "But she really was. She showed me her uniform and her trident pin." Mrs. Henderson smiled in the way adults do when they think a child is being creative with the truth. "Sometimes our parents tell us stories to make us feel special, sweetheart. Maybe your mom was in the Navy, but probably not the SEALs. The damage was done." Even the teacher didn't believe her. Emma's shoulders slumped as the other kids continued to snicker and whisper among themselves. Word spread quickly through the school, as it always does with children. By lunchtime, half the 3rd grade knew that Emma Martinez was the girl who made up stories about her mom being some kind of super soldier. Sarah picked Emma up from school that afternoon and immediately knew something was wrong. Her usually chatty daughter sat silently in the passenger seat, staring out the window with puffy red eyes. "How was school today, mija?" Sarah asked gently, using the Spanish term of endearment that always made Emma smile. "Nobody believes you were really a SEAL," Emma whispered without looking at her mother. "They all think I'm a liar." Sarah pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to face her daughter. The pain in Emma's voice cut through her like a knife. For years, Sarah had kept the details of her military service relatively private. She had told Emma the basic facts because she believed in honesty, but she hadn't shared the full extent of what she had done or the recognition she had received. "Baby, what exactly did you tell them?" Sarah asked softly. "I just said my mom was in the Navy SEALs. Tommy said girls can't be SEALs, so I told him you were one of the first. But everyone laughed at me. Even Mrs. Henderson said you probably just worked in an office." Sarah felt a familiar fire building in her chest. It was the same feeling she had experienced during her years of service when people underestimated her capabilities because of her gender. She had broken barriers and proven herself time and time again, but apparently the civilian world was still catching up. "Listen to me, Emma," Sarah said, taking her daughter's small hands in her own. "Everything you said is true. I was one of the first women to complete Navy SEAL training. I served my country for 8 years, and I'm proud of that service. Just because some people don't know the facts doesn't mean you should ever feel ashamed of the truth." Emma looked up at her mother with hope flickering in her eyes. "Then why don't they believe me?" "Because sometimes people think they know everything, but they don't. The military has changed a lot over the years, and not everyone keeps up with those changes. Some people still think certain jobs are only for men, but that's not true anymore." "Can you come to school and tell them?" Emma asked eagerly. Sarah hesitated. She had spent years blending into civilian life, working as a fitness instructor and keeping her military background in the past. She didn't like drawing attention to herself or her service, but seeing her daughter's pain made her reconsider. "We'll see, baby. For now, just remember that you never have to lie or make yourself smaller to make other people comfortable. You come from a family of strong people who serve others. That's something to be proud of no matter what anyone says. The next morning at school wasn't any better for Emma. The story had spread even further, and now kids from other grades were approaching her in the hallways to ask if it was true that her mom thought she was a Navy SEAL. The way they said it made it sound ridiculous, like claiming her mother was a superhero or a movie star. During lunch, Emma sat alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria. She could hear groups of kids whispering and giggling, occasionally glancing in her direction. A few brave souls came over to ask her directly about her story, but their tone made it clear they expected her to admit she had been lying. "My dad says women weren't allowed to be SEALs until just a few years ago," said Jessica, a girl from Emma's class who was usually friendly. "So your mom couldn't have been one of the first ones?" "That doesn't make sense." Emma felt her cheeks burn with frustration. "My mom told me she was one of the first. Why would she lie to me?" "Maybe she was confused," Jessica suggested, not unkindly. "Or maybe she meant she worked with the SEALs somehow, like as a secretary or something." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several older kids who had heard about the controversy. They surrounded Emma's table, all talking at once and demanding she admit that she had made the whole thing up. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control, and Emma felt trapped and overwhelmed. That's when Mrs. Peterson, the school principal, appeared at the table. She had been observing the situation from across the cafeteria and decided to intervene before things got worse. "All right, everyone back to your own tables," she said firmly. "Emma, would you please come with me to my office? I think we need to have a conversation." Emma sat in the principal's office, her legs swinging nervously from the big chair that made her feel even smaller than usual. Mrs. Peterson sat across from her, wearing the kind of serious expression that adults get when they think a child has done something wrong. "Emma, I've been hearing some interesting stories about your mother," Mrs. Peterson began, folding her hands on her desk. "Several teachers and students have come to me with concerns about some claims you've been making." "They're not claims," Emma said quietly. "They're true." Mrs. Peterson smiled in that patient way that adults use when they think they know better than a child. "Honey, I understand that you're proud of your mom and want other kids to think she's special. All children feel that way about their parents. But making up stories isn't the right way to get attention." Emma felt her face getting hot. "I'm not making up stories. My mom really was a Navy SEAL. She has pictures and medals and everything." "Emma, I did some research after I heard about this situation," Mrs. Peterson said, pulling out a piece of paper from her desk drawer. "According to everything I could find online, the first woman didn't even attempt Navy SEAL training until 2017, and none have successfully completed the program yet. So you see, what you're saying simply isn't possible." The principal showed Emma the printout from her computer search. The headline read, "First Women Attempt Navy SEAL Training," and was dated from just a few years ago. Emma stared at the paper, feeling confused and betrayed. If this was true, then why had her mom told her something different? "But my mom said," Emma started to protest. "Sometimes parents tell us stories to make us feel special," Mrs. Peterson interrupted gently. "Maybe your mom was in the Navy, and maybe she told you about the SEALs to make her service sound more exciting to a little girl. That doesn't make her a bad person, Emma. But continuing to tell this story to other children is causing problems." Emma felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had been so sure that her mom had told her the truth. Her mother had shown her the uniform hanging in the closet, the shiny trident pin, and the framed certificates on the wall of her home office. But now this adult was telling her that none of it could be real. "I want to call my mom," Emma whispered. Mrs. Peterson shook her head. "I think it would be better if we handled this here at school first. Emma, I need you to understand that lying to other children is serious. It's caused quite a disruption, and some of the other kids' parents are upset. I'm going to need you to tell the truth and apologize to the children you've been telling these stories to." "But I am telling the truth," Emma insisted, her voice cracking. "Emma, we've been through this. The facts don't support what you're saying. Now I'm going to have Mrs. Henderson talk to your class this afternoon about the importance of honesty, and I expect you to stand up and tell everyone that you were mistaken about your mother's military service." The rest of the school day passed in a blur for Emma. Word had spread throughout the entire school about her upcoming apology. Kids who had never even spoken to her before were approaching her in the hallways, some looking sympathetic and others seeming eager to witness her humiliation. During math class, Emma couldn't concentrate on the numbers on her worksheet. She kept thinking about her mom's proud face when she had shown her the uniform and told her stories about her service. Had it all been lies? But why would her mom lie about something so important? When the final bell rang, Emma walked slowly toward her mother's car in the pickup line. Sarah immediately noticed her daughter's dejected expression and the way she was dragging her backpack behind her, instead of carrying it properly. "Mia, what happened today?" Sarah asked as Emma climbed into the passenger seat. Emma burst into tears. Through her sobs, she told her mother about the meeting with the principal, the research Mrs. Peterson had done, and the demand that she apologize to her classmates for lying. Sarah's knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel. She had faced enemy fire, survived grueling training that broke grown men, and completed missions that remained classified to this day. But nothing had prepared her for the fury she felt, knowing that her daughter was being called a liar for telling the truth about her mother's service. "Mrs. Peterson wants me to say I was lying," Emma hiccuped between tears. "She showed me papers that said women never finished SEAL training. She said you probably just made up stories to make me feel special." Sarah pulled into an empty parking lot and turned off the engine. She sat in silence for a moment, weighing her options. She had worked hard to maintain her privacy since leaving the military. The nature of her service meant that many of the details weren't public record. She had been part of a classified program that most people, including school principals who did quick internet searches, wouldn't know about. "Emma, look at me," Sarah said firmly. "Everything I told you about my service is true. I was one of the first women to complete the program, but it was part of a special unit that most people don't know about. The information your principal found online doesn't tell the whole story." "Then why does everyone think I'm lying?" Emma asked, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "Because sometimes the truth isn't easy to find, especially when it comes to military operations. But that doesn't mean we should be ashamed of the truth or let other people make us feel bad for sharing it." Sarah made a decision that would change everything. "Emma, how would you feel if some of my old teammates came to your school tomorrow?" Emma's eyes widened. "Really? They would do that?" "Let me make some phone calls," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "I think it's time for your school to learn a few things they don't teach in their internet searches." That evening, Sarah spent hours on the phone with former colleagues scattered across the country. She hadn't spoken to some of them in years, but the bonds forged in service ran deep. When she explained the situation, every single person she contacted offered to help. "You know I've got your six, Martinez," said Commander Jake Thompson, who now worked at the Pentagon. "This is exactly the kind of ignorance we've been fighting against for years. Time to educate some civilians." Lieutenant Sarah Chen, now an instructor at Naval Special Warfare Command, was equally supportive. "I'll make some calls tonight. We can have documentation and personnel there by tomorrow afternoon if needed." By the time Emma went to bed, Sarah had assembled a plan that would leave no doubt about the truth of her daughter's claims. She had tried to live quietly and let her service speak for itself, but sometimes the truth needed a louder voice. The next morning, Emma walked into school with her head held high for the first time in days. Her mom had promised that the truth would come out, and Emma believed her completely. She endured another morning of whispers and sideways glances, but she didn't let them bother her anymore. During lunch, Mrs. Peterson made an announcement over the intercom. "Students, we will be having a special assembly this afternoon in the gymnasium. We have some very important visitors who will be speaking to us about military service." Emma smiled to herself. She didn't know exactly what her mom had planned, but she knew it was going to be good. The other kids had no idea what was coming, but they were about to learn that Emma Martinez had been telling the truth all along. The black SUVs arrived at Riverside Elementary School precisely at 1:30 p.m. 3 identical vehicles pulled up to the front entrance in perfect formation, their windows tinted dark enough that curious onlookers couldn't see inside. The school secretary, Mrs. Williams, noticed them first from her desk by the window. "Mrs. Peterson, I think our visitors are here," she called to the principal, who was in her office preparing remarks for the assembly she still didn't fully understand the purpose of. Mrs. Peterson looked out her window and felt her stomach drop. She had agreed to the assembly when Sarah Martinez called that morning, explaining that she wanted to provide some clarification about her military service. But Mrs. Peterson had expected maybe 1 or 2 veterans in casual clothes, not an official-looking convoy that made the school look like it was hosting a presidential visit. 8 people emerged from the vehicles, and it was immediately clear that these were not ordinary visitors. The men and women were all in dress uniforms, their posture unmistakably military, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The insignia on their uniforms gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and even from a distance, Mrs. Peterson could see rows of ribbons and medals across their chests. Leading the group was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His uniform bore the eagles of a Navy captain, and the trident pin on his chest caught the light as he walked. Behind him followed a diverse group that included both men and women, all carrying themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from elite training and real-world experience. Mrs. Williams buzzed them into the building, and the group moved through the hallways with military precision. Students who were transitioning between classes stopped to stare, their conversations falling to whispers as they took in the impressive sight. Teachers poked their heads out of their classrooms, equally curious about the unexpected visitors. "Good afternoon, I'm Captain James Morrison, Naval Special Warfare Command." The lead officer introduced himself to Mrs. Peterson, extending his hand in a firm handshake. "I believe you're expecting us." Mrs. Peterson nodded weakly, feeling increasingly out of her depth. "Yes, of course. Mrs. Martinez mentioned that some veterans wanted to speak to our students about military service. Actually, we're here for a somewhat more specific purpose," Captain Morrison said, his tone professional but with an undertone that suggested this was more than just a friendly school visit. "We understand there has been some confusion about the service record of one of your parents, Sarah Martinez. We're here to set the record straight." One of the other officers stepped forward. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her uniform bore the insignia of a lieutenant commander, and her trident pin was identical to the captain's. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Lisa Rodriguez," she said. "I served alongside Sarah Martinez for 3 years. I thought it might be helpful for the children to hear from someone who was actually there." Mrs. Peterson felt her face growing warm. The internet research she had done suddenly seemed very inadequate compared to standing face-to-face with people who clearly knew what they were talking about. But she had already committed to having Emma apologize to her classmates, and backing down now would be embarrassing. "Well, I appreciate you coming," Mrs. Peterson said carefully, "but I think there may be some confusion. According to my research, women haven't successfully completed Navy SEAL training. I'm sure Mrs. Martinez served honorably in some capacity, but perhaps there's been some misunderstanding about the specific nature of her service." The officers exchanged glances, and Mrs. Peterson could see something that looked like amusement in their expressions. Captain Morrison pulled out a tablet and handed it to her. "Mrs. Peterson, what you found in your internet search was information about the current SEAL training program that was open to women in recent years. What you didn't find, because it's still largely classified, is information about the special operations programs that were already integrating women into elite units over a decade ago." Mrs. Peterson looked down at the tablet screen, which displayed an official Navy document with more stamps and signatures than she had ever seen. The header read, "Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Personnel Records," and was marked with various classification levels. Sarah Martinez completed one of the most challenging selection processes in the military, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez continued. She was part of a pilot program that was testing the integration of women into special operations roles. The program was highly classified, which is why you won't find much about it in public records. Another officer, a younger man with the bearing of someone who had seen significant combat, stepped forward. "Chief Petty Officer Mike Stevens," he introduced himself. "I was Sarah's swim buddy during Hell Week. I've seen grown men twice her size quit during training that she completed without a single complaint." Mrs. Peterson stared at the tablet, trying to process what she was reading. The document clearly listed Sarah Martinez as having completed Special Operations combat training and showed deployment records to locations that were marked as classified. The dates aligned with what Emma had been telling her classmates. "But the news articles I found said," Mrs. Peterson began weakly, "the news articles you found were about the public announcement of women being allowed to attempt standard SEAL training," Captain Morrison explained patiently. That was indeed a historic moment. But it wasn't the first time women had been involved in naval special operations. Programs like the one Sarah participated in were kept quiet for operational security reasons. The group began moving toward the gymnasium, where students and teachers were already gathering for the assembly. Mrs. Peterson walked alongside them, her mind reeling. She was beginning to realize that she had made a serious mistake, and that Emma Martinez had been telling the truth all along. In the gymnasium, over 400 students and staff members had assembled. Emma sat in the front row with her class, her heart pounding with anticipation. She could see her mother standing at the back of the room, wearing a simple black dress but carrying herself with the same confident posture as the officers who had just arrived. The other students were buzzing with excitement about the unexpected visitors. Tommy Richardson, who had started the whole controversy by mocking Emma's claims, was actually looking nervous for the first time anyone could remember. Mrs. Henderson sat with the other teachers, looking confused about why a simple case of a child telling tall tales had turned into such a major event. Captain Morrison stepped to the podium that had been set up in the center of the gymnasium floor. The room fell silent as his commanding presence filled the space. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the room without him needing to raise it. "Good afternoon, students and faculty of Riverside Elementary," he began. "My name is Captain James Morrison, and I'm here today with some of my colleagues from Naval Special Warfare Command. We've come to talk to you about service, sacrifice, and the importance of understanding the full story before making judgments." He paused, letting his eyes sweep across the assembled crowd. "But first, we need to address a situation that has come to our attention. It seems that one of your students, Emma Martinez, has been accused of lying about her mother's military service." Emma felt her cheeks burn as hundreds of eyes turned toward her, but for the first time in days she didn't feel ashamed. She sat up straighter in her chair, meeting the curious gazes of her classmates with confidence. "I'm here to tell you that Emma Martinez has been telling the absolute truth," Captain Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Her mother, Sarah Martinez, is one of the most accomplished special operations personnel I have ever had the honor of serving with." The gymnasium was so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop. Tommy Richardson's mouth had fallen open, and Mrs. Henderson was staring at the officers with wide eyes. "But before we continue," Captain Morrison said, "I think it would be appropriate for Emma's mother to join us up here. After all, this is her story to tell." Sarah Martinez walked toward the front of the gymnasium with measured steps, her civilian clothes contrasting sharply with the formal military uniforms surrounding her. But despite wearing a simple black dress instead of a uniform, there was something unmistakably authoritative about her presence. The students, who had been whispering and fidgeting moments before, fell completely silent as she approached the podium. Emma watched her mother with pride swelling in her chest. For days she had endured mockery and disbelief from her classmates and teachers. Now finally the truth was about to come out. "Thank you, Captain Morrison," Sarah said as she reached the front of the assembly. Her voice was steady and clear, carrying the same quiet confidence that Emma had always admired in her mother. "Students and faculty of Riverside Elementary, I'm Sarah Martinez, Emma's mom." She paused, looking out over the sea of faces staring back at her. In the front row, she could see Tommy Richardson looking distinctly uncomfortable, his earlier smugness replaced by obvious worry. Mrs. Henderson was fidgeting with her hands, beginning to realize the magnitude of the mistake that had been made. "I understand that there has been some confusion about my military service," Sarah continued, "and I want to take a moment to explain why that confusion exists, and why my daughter has been telling you the absolute truth." Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez stepped forward, carrying a large display board that had been covered with a cloth. With a swift motion, she removed the covering to reveal a timeline filled with photographs, official documents, and military insignia. "In 2008, Sarah began, pointing to the first section of the display, "I was selected for a highly classified program called Maritime Special Operations Integration Initiative. This program was designed to test whether women could successfully integrate into naval special operations roles." The photographs showed a younger Sarah in various training scenarios. There she was climbing ropes, diving from aircraft, and working alongside male teammates in combat gear. The official documents bore the seals of various military commands and were filled with stamps marking them as classified. Materials that had recently been declassified for this presentation The program was kept secret for several reasons, Sarah continued. First, because the military needed to thoroughly test the concept before making any public announcements. Second, because many of our operations were in sensitive locations where our identities needed to remain classified for our safety and the safety of our families. Chief Petty Officer Stevens moved to stand beside the display. I was part of the training cadre that evaluated candidates for this program, he said, his voice carrying the gruff authority of a career military man. Out of 127 candidates who attempted the selection process, only 12 made it through the initial phase. Sarah was one of only 3 who completed the entire program. Mrs. Peterson, who had been standing at the side of the gymnasium, felt her stomach churning with embarrassment. The evidence being presented was overwhelming, and it was becoming clear that she had made a terrible mistake in doubting Emma's story. Sarah moved to the next section of the timeline. After completing the selection and training process, I was assigned to Naval Special Warfare Unit 17, a unit that doesn't appear in most public records because of the nature of our missions. The next set of photographs showed Sarah in full combat gear in what appeared to be various international locations. Some images had been partially redacted to protect sensitive information, but enough remained visible to show her clearly participating in serious military operations. Over the course of my 8-year career, Sarah continued, I participated in 47 combat missions across 3 different theaters of operation. I was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor, the Navy Commendation Medal, and the Combat Action Ribbon, among others. Captain Morrison stepped forward carrying a wooden case. He opened it carefully to reveal a collection of military medals and decorations, their ribbons bright and their metal gleaming under the gymnasium lights. These are Sarah's actual decorations, he announced to the assembly. Each one represents service, sacrifice, and accomplishment that most people will never fully understand. Emma felt tears of pride forming in her eyes. She had seen these medals in her mother's study at home, but she had never heard the full story of how they were earned. Looking around the gymnasium, she could see that her classmates were absolutely mesmerized by what they were witnessing. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez picked up the presentation. The reason your internet searches didn't find information about Sarah's service is because much of it remained classified until very recently. The public announcement about women attempting SEAL training that you found refers to a different, more publicized program that began years after Sarah had already completed her service. But why keep it secret for so long? Asked Mr. Jenkins, Emma's 3rd-grade teacher, who had been watching the presentation with growing amazement. Several reasons, Sarah replied. First, many of our operations involved sensitive international situations where revealing the identities of team members could have put them and their families at risk. Second, the military wanted to thoroughly evaluate the success of the program before making public announcements that could become political issues. She moved to the final section of the display, which showed recent documents and photographs. The program was officially declassified last year, which is why I'm able to share these details with you now. But for years, those of us who participated were required to keep the specifics of our service private. Tommy Richardson slowly raised his hand, his face red with embarrassment. Mrs. Martinez, I'm sorry I said girls couldn't be SEALs. I didn't know. Sarah looked at him with kindness rather than anger. Tommy, you were working with the information you had available, but this is exactly why it's important not to dismiss something just because it doesn't match what we think we know. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, her face pale but her expression resolute. Mrs. Martinez, I owe you and Emma a profound apology. I should have done more thorough research before concluding that Emma was not telling the truth. I'm truly sorry for the distress this has caused your family. And more importantly, she continued, turning to address Emma directly, Emma, I owe you an apology for not believing you and for asking you to apologize to your classmates. You were telling the truth and I was wrong to doubt you. Emma nodded, accepting the apology with the grace her mother had taught her. But she could see that there was more her mother wanted to share with the assembly. Sarah returned to the podium for her closing remarks. I want all of you students to remember something important from today. Just because information isn't easy to find doesn't mean it isn't true. Just because something seems unlikely doesn't mean it's impossible. And just because someone is different from what you expect doesn't mean they can't accomplish extraordinary things. She looked directly at her daughter in the front row. Emma has shown tremendous courage over the past few days by standing up for the truth, even when everyone around her said she was wrong. That kind of integrity is exactly what we need more of in this world. Captain Morrison returned to the podium. We have a few more things to share with you about the realities of modern military service and the changing roles of women in combat operations. But I think we've established the most important point. Emma Martinez has been telling you the truth about her mother's service, and she deserves an apology from anyone who suggested otherwise. The gymnasium erupted in applause, but it was different from the mocking laughter that had filled the playground just days before. This was applause filled with respect, admiration, and more than a little awe at what they had just learned. Emma sat straighter in her chair, feeling vindicated and proud. But more than that, she felt grateful to have learned something important about standing up for the truth, even when it's difficult, and even when people don't want to believe you. The atmosphere in the gymnasium had completely transformed. Where there had once been skepticism and mockery, now there was rapt attention and genuine respect. Captain Morrison gestured to his team, and they began setting up additional displays that would reveal even more about Sarah's extraordinary service record. Now that we've established the truth about Mrs. Martinez's service, Captain Morrison continued, I think it's important for you to understand exactly what that service entailed. This isn't just about proving Emma right. This is about understanding what real heroism looks like. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez unveiled another display board, this one showing a world map with various locations marked in red. These are some of the places where Sarah Martinez served her country, she explained. Each red mark represents a mission where she put her life on the line to protect American interests and save American lives. The students leaned forward in their seats, completely captivated. Even the teachers, who had seen plenty of school assemblies over the years, were hanging on every word. Chief Petty Officer Stevens stepped forward, his weathered face serious. I want to tell you about one particular mission that Sarah was part of. It's been declassified now, so I can share the details. He pointed to a location on the map in the Mediterranean Sea. 3 years ago, a cargo ship carrying American medical supplies was hijacked by pirates off the coast of Somalia. 23 crew members were being held hostage, including 2 American doctors who were delivering supplies to refugee camps. The gymnasium was completely silent. Even the younger students seemed to understand that they were hearing about something very serious and very real. Sarah was part of a 6-person team that was inserted by helicopter onto that ship at night, Stevens continued. The pirates were armed and had threatened to kill the hostages if any rescue was attempted. The operation required swimming to the ship, climbing aboard without being detected, and neutralizing the threat before any hostages could be harmed. Sarah stood quietly beside the display, her expression calm, but Emma could see the tension in her mother's shoulders. This was clearly not easy for her to have shared publicly. The mission was successful, Stevens continued. All hostages were rescued without injury, and the pirates were captured. But during the operation, Sarah sustained serious injuries while protecting one of the doctors who had been shot. During the initial hijacking, he turned to look directly at Sarah. She carried that wounded doctor over 200 yards under enemy fire to get him to the extraction point. She saved his life and probably the lives of several other hostages as well. Mrs. Henderson, who had been one of Emma's biggest doubters, was now staring at Sarah with obvious awe. The teacher who had suggested that Emma's mother probably just worked in an office was beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. Captain Morrison picked up the story. For her actions during that mission, Sarah was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor, but more importantly, Dr. Michael Chen, the man she saved, is now running a children's hospital in Africa. The medical supplies on that ship eventually reached refugee camps where they saved hundreds of lives. Emma felt her chest swelling with pride. She had known her mother was a hero, but she had never heard these specific details. Looking around the gymnasium, she could see that her classmates were equally impressed. Tommy Richardson raised his hand tentatively. Mrs. Martinez, were you scared during missions like that? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. Yes, Tommy, I was scared many times. Being brave doesn't mean you don't feel fear. It means you do what's right even when you are afraid. She walked closer to where the students were sitting. Every person on my team was scared during dangerous missions. But we trained together, We trusted each other, and we knew that innocent people were counting on us. That gave us the strength to push through the fear. Another student, a quiet girl named Maria, raised her hand. How did you get strong enough to do all those things? It took years of training, Sarah replied. Physical training, mental training, and emotional training. The hardest part wasn't the swimming or climbing or shooting. The hardest part was learning to never give up, even when everything seemed impossible. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez stepped forward with a new photograph. This picture was taken during Sarah's Hell Week training, she said, showing an image of Sarah and several male teammates covered in mud, looking exhausted but determined. Hell Week is 5.5 days of continuous training with almost no sleep, she explained. Candidates are pushed to their absolute physical and mental limits. Many people who are bigger and stronger than Sarah quit during this phase. She never even considered quitting. Chief Petty Officer Stevens nodded. I remember watching her during the log carries. Teams had to carry 200-pound logs over their heads for miles through sand and surf. Sarah weighed maybe 130 pounds soaking wet, but she never let her team down. She carried her share and more. Mrs. Peterson, who had been listening with growing amazement, stepped forward. Mrs. Martinez, I have to ask, why didn't you share any of this information when I called you about the situation with Emma? If I had known... Sarah's expression softened. Mrs. Peterson, for 8 years after I left the military, I've tried to live a quiet civilian life. I work as a fitness instructor now, I volunteer at the animal shelter, and I coach Emma's soccer team. I didn't want my past to define me or to make people treat me differently. She looked out at the assembled students. But when my daughter was being called a liar for telling the truth about her mother, that crossed a line. Emma has every right to be proud of her family's service, and no one should ever make her feel ashamed for sharing that pride. Captain Morrison addressed the school staff directly. This situation highlights something very important. The nature of military service has changed dramatically over the past 2 decades. Many operations remain classified for years, and the roles of women in combat have expanded far beyond what most civilians realize. He pulled out another document. Currently, there are over 300 women serving in various special operations roles across all branches of the military. Most of their service records aren't public knowledge for security reasons. Just because you can't find something in a quick internet search doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Principal Peterson nodded slowly. We clearly need to do better research and ask better questions before making assumptions. This has been a learning experience for all of us. Emma finally raised her hand. When her mother nodded encouragingly, she stood up to address the assembly. I want to thank everyone for listening to the truth about my mom, but I also want to say that even if she wasn't a Navy SEAL, she would still be my hero. She teaches me to be strong, to tell the truth, and to never give up. Those are the things that matter most. The gymnasium erupted in applause, and this time it was filled with genuine admiration for both Emma and her mother. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched her daughter handle the situation with such maturity and grace. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez had one more surprise. She wheeled out a display case containing Sarah's actual uniform and equipment. This is the gear Sarah wore during her final deployment, she announced. The uniform, the tactical vest, the night vision goggles, and yes, the trident pin that Emma mentioned. The students gasped as they saw the real equipment up close. It looked exactly like something from an action movie, but this was real life, and it had belonged to someone they now knew personally. Mrs. Martinez, called out Jessica, the girl who had suggested Sarah might have been confused about her service. Would you ever consider talking to our class about what it was like being one of the first women in special operations? Sarah smiled. I think I could arrange that. There are some important lessons about perseverance and breaking barriers that might be worth sharing. As the assembly began to wind down, Captain Morrison made one final announcement. Before we leave today, we have something for Emma Martinez. One of the other officers came forward carrying a framed certificate. Emma, this is a certificate of appreciation from Naval Special Warfare Command. It recognizes your courage in standing up for the truth about your mother's service, even when it was difficult and even when people didn't believe you. Emma walked to the front of the gymnasium to accept the certificate, her face glowing with pride. The entire school rose to give her a standing ovation. The same courage that your mother showed in combat, Captain Morrison said as he handed her the certificate. You showed right here in your school. That kind of integrity is exactly what we need in the next generation of Americans. As the students filed out of the gymnasium, Many of them stopped to shake Sarah's hand or to apologize to Emma for not believing her story. The mood in the school had completely changed, and Emma knew that tomorrow would be very different from the past few days. Tommy Richardson was one of the last students to approach. "Emma, I'm really sorry I called you a liar. Your mom is the coolest person I've ever met." Emma smiled and accepted his apology graciously. "It's okay, Tommy, you just didn't know the whole story yet." As the military officers packed up their displays and prepared to leave, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in just one afternoon. She had spent years keeping her military service in the background, but today had reminded her that there was value in sharing her story, especially when it could inspire young people to pursue their own dreams, regardless of what others might think is possible. 3 months had passed since the assembly at Riverside Elementary, and the ripple effects of that day continued to spread far beyond the school's walls. Emma Martinez walked through the hallways with a confidence that hadn't been there before, but more importantly, the entire school culture had begun to shift in ways no one had expected. The story of Sarah Martinez and her daughter's courage had spread throughout the district and beyond. Local news stations had picked up the story, and it had gone viral on social media with the hashtag #BelieveOurChildren. Parents, educators, and military families across the country were sharing their own stories of times when children had been dismissed for telling difficult truths. Emma's classroom had become something of a showcase for the school district. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher, had redesigned her curriculum to include lessons about research skills, the importance of primary sources, and how to verify information before making judgments. The story of Emma and her mother had become a central case study in critical thinking. Who can tell me what we learned from Emma's situation about the importance of thorough research? Mrs. Patterson asked her class during their weekly current events discussion. Jessica raised her hand eagerly. She had become one of Emma's closest friends since the assembly, bonding over their shared interest in learning about military history. "We learned that just because something isn't easy to find online doesn't mean it's not true. Sometimes the most important information is the hardest to find." Tommy Richardson, who had undergone perhaps the biggest transformation of anyone, added, "And we learned that we shouldn't make fun of people just because they're telling us something we've never heard before." The boy who had once been Emma's biggest tormentor had become one of her strongest supporters. His parents had been so impressed by Sarah's presentation that they had arranged for Tommy to participate in a youth leadership program that emphasized respect and integrity. The change in his behavior had been remarkable. Mrs. Peterson had also made significant changes to her approach as principal. She had instituted new policies requiring multiple sources and consultation with experts before the school made any official statements about student claims. She had also started a monthly Truth and Courage assembly where students and community members could share stories about standing up for what's right. The Martinez situation taught us all an important lesson about the danger of making assumptions, she explained to a group of visiting educators from other schools. "We nearly punished a child for telling the truth because we didn't do our homework properly. That's not a mistake we can afford to make again." The impact had reached far beyond the school as well. Sarah had been contacted by military organizations, women's groups, and educational institutions asking her to speak about her experiences. She had initially been reluctant to step into the spotlight, but Emma had encouraged her to share their story more widely. "Mom, if our story can help other kids not get made fun of for telling the truth, shouldn't we share it?" Emma had asked one evening as they discussed another speaking invitation. That conversation had led to Sarah accepting a position as a part-time consultant with the Department of Defense, helping to develop programs that would better communicate the changing roles of women in military service. She was working to ensure that situations like Emma's wouldn't happen to other military families. One of Sarah's first projects was creating educational materials for schools about modern military service. The materials included information about the diverse roles that service members, both male and female, play in today's armed forces. The goal was to help educators and students understand the full scope of military service beyond the traditional stereotypes. We realized that there was a significant gap between what military service actually looks like today and what most civilians understand about it, Sarah explained to a group of school principals during a training session. That gap led to my daughter being called a liar for sharing accurate information about her mother's service. The materials Sarah developed were being pilot tested in school districts across 3 states, with plans for national distribution if the initial results were positive. Early feedback had been overwhelmingly positive, with teachers reporting that students were much more engaged when learning about military history and current events. Emma had also found her voice as a young advocate. She had been invited to speak at several student leadership conferences about the importance of standing up for the truth, even when it's difficult. Her natural confidence and compelling story made her an effective speaker despite her young age. When people don't believe you, it doesn't mean you should stop telling the truth, Emma told a group of middle school students during one presentation. It means you need to find better ways to help them understand what you're saying. At home, the relationship between Emma and Sarah had deepened as well. Sarah had begun sharing more details about her military service, helping Emma understand not just what she had done, but why she had chosen to serve and what those experiences had taught her about life. I used to think the most important thing I did in the military was the missions and the medals, Sarah told Emma one evening, as they looked through old photographs together. But now I think the most important thing was learning to never give up on what's right, even when it's hard. That's what you did at school, and I'm more proud of that than any medal I ever earned. The officers who had come to the school that day had also stayed in touch with the Martinez family. Captain Morrison had recommended Emma for a youth leadership program run by the Naval Academy, and Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez had become something of a mentor, helping Emma understand the various paths available to young women interested in military or public service. The story had even reached the highest levels of the military. Sarah received a letter from the Secretary of the Navy, commending both her service and her daughter's courage in standing up for the truth. The letter acknowledged that the military needed to do better at helping civilian communities understand the evolving nature of military service. Back at Riverside Elementary, the changes had become permanent parts of the school culture. The library now had an entire section dedicated to military history and the stories of service members from diverse backgrounds. Students regularly conducted research projects about local veterans and their contributions to their communities. The school had also started a mentorship program connecting students with local veterans and active duty service members. Emma was one of the program coordinators, helping to match students with mentors based on their interests and career goals. Emma has shown us what leadership looks like, Mrs. Peterson explained to parents during a PTA meeting. She stood up for the truth when it was difficult. She handled conflict with grace, and she used her experience to help make things better for other students. Those are exactly the qualities we want to foster in all our children. Tommy Richardson had become one of the program's most enthusiastic participants. His mentor was a female Air Force pilot who had helped him understand that there were no limits to what he could achieve if he worked hard and treated others with respect. Meeting Emma's mom and learning about all the things women do in the military really changed how I think about stuff, Tommy explained to his parents. I used to think only certain kinds of people could do certain kinds of jobs, but that's not true at all. The ripple effects continued to spread in unexpected directions. Other parents in the community had been inspired to share their own stories of service and sacrifice. The school district had started a community oral history project, recording the experiences of local veterans and their families. 1 year after the assembly, Riverside Elementary held a special commemoration event. Sarah was invited back as the keynote speaker, and she brought with her several other veterans who had served in various roles and time periods. A year ago, my daughter was called a liar for telling the truth about her mother's service. Sarah began her remarks. Today, this school is a model for how communities can come together to support truth-telling and celebrate the diverse contributions of all service members. Emma, now a confident fourth grader, introduced each of the visiting veterans and helped facilitate a question and answer session. Her poise and knowledge impressed everyone in attendance, and it was clear that the experience had shaped her into a natural leader. This whole thing taught me that sometimes the truth is hard to believe. But that doesn't make it less true, Emma told the assembled crowd. And it taught me that when you know something is right, you shouldn't give up, even if people don't believe you at first. As the event concluded, Mrs. Peterson reflected on how much had changed since that day when she had asked Emma to apologize for lying about her mother's service. The school had become a better place for all students, and the community had gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity and diversity of military service. We learned that our assumptions can be wrong, that quick internet searches aren't always sufficient, and that children sometimes know important truths that adults have forgotten, she said. Most importantly, we learned that standing up for the truth, even when it's difficult, is always the right thing to do. The story of Emma Martinez and her mother had become more than just a tale of vindication. It had become a lesson about courage, integrity, and the importance of believing in truth even when that truth challenges our assumptions about what's possible. And in the end, that lesson had spread far beyond one elementary school in one small town, inspiring people across the country to look more carefully at their own assumptions and to listen more closely when children have important truths to share.